The lawyers showed up just after sunrise, their dark suits filling the doorway of a tiny tailor shop that smelled of steam, fabric, and old hope, papers in hand, faces unreadable. The woman behind the counter froze, needle still between her fingers, heart pounding. 24 hours earlier, she had given something away for free. Now everything felt like it was about to change. Before I continue, let me take a quiet moment to say this. If stories about real people, unseen kindness, and human strength matter to you, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Sage Stories, give this video a like if it speaks to you, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice belongs here, just like hers did. The tailor shop sat on a tired block in Southside Chicago, wedged between a closed-down beauty supply store and a pawn shop with dusty windows. The sign above the door had faded letters, some missing entirely, but inside, the space was clean, warm, and carefully kept. That shop had been her whole world for almost 15 years. Not because it made her rich. It never had. But because it was the one place where her hands could still turn struggle into something useful. She learned to sew as a girl, sitting at her grandmother's knee, watching fabric become dresses, hems, school uniforms, church clothes. Her grandmother used to say that sewing was a quiet kind of power. You didn't have to shout to fix what was torn. You just had to be patient and steady. Those words stayed with her long after her grandmother passed, long after her parents were gone, long after life had narrowed down to rent notices, late bills, and a shop that barely broke even. Most mornings started the same. She unlocked the door before 8, swept the sidewalk, turned on the lights, and said a small prayer that enough customers would walk in that day. Some days were good. Alterations for weddings, prom dresses, a uniform repair for a security guard who couldn't afford a new one. Other days were painfully quiet. She would sit behind the counter, mending scraps of old fabric, listening to the hum of the city outside, wondering how much longer she could keep going. Being a black woman running a small business in that neighborhood meant carrying more than just financial stress. It meant being invisible to some people and judged by others before she ever spoke. Banks turned her down for loans without explanation. Suppliers demanded payment up front. Customers sometimes assumed her work would be sloppy or cheap, just because of where her shop was located. She learned to smile through it, to let the quality of her stitches speak louder than any argument ever could. That particular afternoon, rain had been falling steadily, the kind that soaks through shoes and tempers alike. The shop was empty when the bell over the door rang. She looked up, expecting maybe a neighbor needing a quick fix. Instead, a tall man stepped inside, shaking water from his coat. He didn't look lost, but he didn't look comfortable either. His suit was expensive, even to her trained eye, but it hung awkwardly on his frame, like it had been rushed or mishandled. He glanced around, taking in the cramped space. The old machines, the spools of thread arranged by color. For a moment, she thought he might leave. That happened sometimes. People would step in, see the neighborhood, see her, and quietly step back out. But he stayed. He asked politely if she did same-day alterations. She told him she did, depending on the work. He explained that he had an important meeting the next morning. Very important. The suit had been custom-made, or at least supposed to be, but something was wrong. The sleeves pulled. The shoulders sat off. It didn't move the way it should. He sounded frustrated, but also tired, like a man who was used to things going right and was thrown off when they didn't. She asked him to put the jacket on. As he did, she circled him slowly, fingers hovering just above the fabric, eyes sharp and focused. She could see the problem immediately. The lining had been cut incorrectly, throwing off the balance of the entire suit. It wasn't a simple fix. It would take time, care, a willingness to take the whole thing apart and rebuild it. She told him honestly that it would take several hours, likely into the evening. His shoulders sagged with relief rather than annoyance. He said that was fine. He had nowhere else to go. As she took his measurements, she noticed his hands. They were steady, confident, but there was a tension there too. A man carrying a lot, even if he didn't show it. They talked lightly while she worked. Nothing personal, just weather, traffic, the way the city never seemed to sleep. He asked how long she'd had the shop. When she told him, he nodded, impressed. 15 years was no small thing. She shrugged it off. Survival had a way of looking like success from the outside. As the afternoon faded into evening, the rain stopped, and the streetlights flickered on outside. She worked carefully, undoing seams that someone else had rushed through. correcting mistakes that should never have been made on a suit like that. She treated it the same way she treated every garment. Whether it belonged to a janitor or a CEO, fabric didn't care who you were. It only responded to patience and skill. When he returned later that night to try it on, the difference was immediate. The suit moved with him instead of against him. His posture changed. He stood taller, breathed easier. He looked at himself in the mirror and let out a slow breath. He hadn't realized he was holding. He asked her how much he owed. She named a price that was fair, even modest, considering the work. He reached for his wallet, then paused. He looked around the shop again, really looked this time. The worn counter. The aging machines. The small space fighting to survive in a city that often forgot places like this. He asked her a quiet question. Why she charged so little? She hesitated. Pride and honesty wrestled inside her. Finally, she told him the truth. Because people around here needed help more than perfection. Because if she charged what big shops charged, her neighbors couldn't come. Because sometimes keeping the lights on mattered more than making a profit. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. Then he surprised her by putting his wallet away. He said something she didn't expect. That this one was on him, but not the way she thought. He insisted on paying her double. She shook her head, uncomfortable. She didn't want charity. He smiled gently and said it wasn't charity. It was respect for her craft. Still, when she rang it up, something in her chest tightened. She thought about the look in his eyes, the stress he carried, and the way that suit had failed him when he needed it most. Before she could overthink it, she made a decision that went against every financial instinct she had. She handed him the receipt and quietly told him she wouldn't be charging him anything, not today. Consider it a gift, a thank you for trusting her work. He stared at her, genuinely stunned. He asked if she was sure. She nodded, feeling both terrified and strangely at peace. He tried to protest again, but she stood firm. Kindness didn't always make sense on paper, but it made sense to her. He left the shop that night in a suit that finally fit, glancing back once before the door closed behind him. She locked up later than usual, the weight of her choice settling in as she counted the cash drawer. Giving away that work meant skipping groceries that week. It meant stretching what little she had even thinner. As she walked home under the glow of streetlights, doubt crept in. Maybe she'd been foolish. Maybe kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. The next morning, she opened the shop like always. Same routine, same quiet hope. She was threading a needle when the bell rang. She looked up, expecting another ordinary day to begin. Instead, she saw the suits. 3 of them. Dark, perfectly pressed. Not customers. Something else. They introduced themselves calmly. Professionally, lawyers. They asked if she was the owner. Her stomach dropped. Her mind raced through every possible mistake she'd ever made. Permits, taxes, paperwork. Had she missed something? Was she in trouble? They asked if they could come in. The shop suddenly felt smaller than ever. She nodded, hands trembling as she set her needle down. One of them mentioned a name she recognized. The man from the night before. Her heart pounded harder. They explained that their client had spoken very highly of her work, of her integrity. They said he had been deeply affected by her decision to fix his suit without charge. He hadn't expected it. In his world, nothing came free, and kindness usually came with strings attached. Hers hadn't. She listened, barely breathing as they continued. They weren't there to threaten her. They weren't there to audit her. They were there to make sure she was protected, to make sure her shop stayed open, to make sure her work didn't go unnoticed again. What followed was overwhelming. Offers of support, legal help, opportunities she had never imagined being within reach. But more than that, it was validation. Someone had seen her. Not as a struggling business owner, not as a charity case, but as a professional whose skill and heart mattered. In the weeks that followed, word spread. Not because of gossip, but because people talk when something real happens. New customers came in, old ones returned with friends. The shop grew busier, louder, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. She hired help, fixed her machines, paid down debts that had haunted her sleep. But the most important change wasn't financial. It was internal. She stood a little taller behind the counter. She spoke with more confidence. She believed finally that her grandmother had been right. Quiet power was still power. The man came back one day, not in a rush this time, just to check in, to see how she was doing. They talked like equals, two people who had crossed paths at exactly the right moment. And that's the thing about kindness. You never really know where it will land or how far it will travel. Sometimes it comes back to you in ways you couldn't plan if you tried. That small tailor shop is still there today, still fixing hems, still mending tears, still proving, stitch by stitch, that dignity doesn't depend on wealth, and generosity doesn't require abundance. It requires courage. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you felt, share that in the comments. These stories live on when we tell them to each other. And remember this, you never know who's standing in front of you, or how one quiet act of kindness might change both your lives.